Hello and welcome to the Domestic Dusters Sew Along with the Royal Voluntary Service as part of the Virtual Village Hall. This 8th of March International Women's Day. It's fantastic to be here and to take this opportunity to share with you my project, Women in Domesticity, What's Your Perspective, otherwise known as the Domestic Dusters Project. So what we're going to be doing this morning is I'm going to be inviting you to work with your own duster if you have one. And to sew along whilst I let you know some things about the project. And there'll be some opportunities to put some things in the chat, to ask some questions, and it'll probably take about an hour. So looking forward to spending this hour with you today. So if you have them to hand, or if you've booked on in advance and you've made a note of things that we asked you to gather, it's great if you've got a duster, so that traditional yellow duster that's popular here in the UK, or another domestic cloth works almost just as well. Needle and thread. It's useful to have a pencil and paper. Some of the things I'll suggest might require doing a quick drawing or making some notes, but you're also very welcome just to listen and to contemplate. And this video will be available later on YouTube as well, so you can always go back to it. So if you've got your duster, that's great, but if not, still very much something that you can get involved in. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do, if you do have a duster with you, is to hold it in your hands. So if you're doing some drawing, or probably you'll have it in the hands you don't write with, there'll be some opportunities to do some stitching. You might be somebody that's already familiar with the project, and perhaps you've picked up the duster that you'd already started, or it might be something that you're just beginning to do. But if you can hold it in your hand, I think that really helps, because one of the really fantastic things about this project is this magic of this cloth. And when you engage with it and think about it as this kind of invisible domestic object, having it in your hand while you're thinking about it can be really helpful. Great to see some people popping up and saying hi. Lovely to see some of you this morning. So you've got your dusters in your hand. Let's go. So a little bit about me. I'm a maker and a writer and a creator. I'm also what's called a practice-based researcher. So that means that in addition to the writing that I do as an academic, I also make alongside it. In fact, very much part of my researching process. So I make to know as well as writing to know, and I exhibit as well as publish writing. And often the two things go together. So when I write an academic paper or a book chapter or something like that, I'll often have work that I've made that sits inside the context of that as well. I'm an academic at the University of Brighton, where I'm course leader. I'm also have a couple of leadership roles as well. I'm a busy mum of 4 girls, most of whom are grown up now, but Women in Domesticity really kind of sums up my life, and has summed up my life for the last 30 years. So that's important to me too. I like to research work and life and what things that really kind of matter to me and my experience. I really love learning. And I really love making with my hands. I genuinely have a daily stitch practice, which can be anything from knitting to embroidery to crochet. Always got way too many projects on the go. That's really important to me as well, this idea of making with my hands. I'm what's called an autoethnographer, and autoethnographers connect the idea of biography to ethnography, which is a study of how people live. And so really I study the way that I live, and then what autoethnographers do is they put that in the context of social or political or economic challenges, and they tell stories as a means of enticing change, as a means of starting conversations. And so when I talk about my work as a practice-based researcher, that's what that does. I put that work that I do with the dusters, exploring women's experiences of domesticity, and put that into that social, political, or economic context. And in that way, my aim is that it makes a difference and that it communicates. So the project was first established in 2014, so it's been going for 10 years now. It's exhibited widely, and there is an ongoing open call for contributions. So whether you have a duster with you now that you're thinking about working with, whether or not you've made one before, if you'd like to get involved, I'm always taking submissions. And the best way to contact me about that is on Instagram or via my blog, and I'll share the details for those at the end of this talk. So the other thing about an open call is that it's without exclusion. So anyone can join in. It is welcome, you know, men are welcome too. They rarely join in, I suppose, because the theme is women and domesticity, and we have this legacy of domesticity that we kind of struggle to shake off, which I'll talk about as we go through. But it genuinely is open to everyone, and there's never been a duster that I've said, no, this can't join in. It's very much DIY making, creativity from right the way through to expert embroiderers. Anyone, almost anyone, can stitch a line of thread. And so the accessibility of this project's really important. The fact that anyone can join in. You don't have to be an artist. You don't have to be a maker. If you are, that's great. You know, everyone's celebrated. And the idea as well is that it's collaborative. So sometimes that collaboration happens in workshops. Sometimes that collaboration happens online, lots and lots of different ways. And as I mentioned before, it's something that I kind of embed into my academic research as well. On the side here, you can see a little pack that I made up. So when I first started with this project, I made these packs together. I have a duster and a needle and a thread and some tips in them, and have sort of been passing them out or selling them or giving them away or funding to give them to people, lots and lots of different contexts, so that it makes it even more accessible in terms of being able to stitch your own duster. So fundamentally, what this project aims to do is to give women a voice. And that's where women are silenced or they're unheard or they're ignored. And that can be in many different contexts. It can be dealing with everyday discrimination, you know, the fact that it's always the woman, not always, but, you know, sometimes you feel it's always you who's that one who's unloading the dishwasher yet again, or perhaps holding that mental load of everything that's required by the family within your head. But sometimes women are not listened to. Sometimes they're in a space where nobody is hearing them. You know, maybe they're experiencing domestic violence, maybe they are homeless, maybe they are displaced, maybe they are undertaking roles that mean that they're isolated. And so it's really where women don't have a voice that the duster is able to step in and be that voice for them. And it challenges gender domestic inequality. So, like I said, that legacy. I know that in many cases, relationships are equal, but nonetheless, that legacy still remains. And even if it's not what you experience or what I always experience, nonetheless, it's something that's there. And I think it's really important that women come together and kind of make that final push for equality that exists in our home and private spaces, as well as in other spaces as well. And of course, you know, that invisible labour can come into the workplace in all sorts of different contexts too. So also aim to build solidarity. There's lots and lots of studies about the benefits of doing things together, of stitching for mental health. So it really does build that sense of community and start those conversations. You know, it doesn't have to be shouting and screaming and demanding. Actually, it can just be about starting those conversations. And there's something about stitching a duster in your own home that can begin those conversations in your own home as well. And as I said, it also advocates for women whose domestic situations are compromised, which sits in a slightly different context to the main project, but nonetheless something that's really important. And I'll tell you a little bit about one of those projects later on. So why did I choose a duster? And what is a duster? In the UK, most people know what a duster is. It's kind of ubiquitous, but it is actually quite defined in the UK and not so much so in the rest of the world. They're in Europe, they're in Australia. They're not in America. I am taking this project to America in March, and I took it again a few years ago, and I had to explain what a duster was because they thought it was a feather duster and wondered how it was that I managed to embroider into it. But in the UK, it's that kind of cloth, you know, it's the cloth that you used to do it properly, don't you? I remember my granny used one. It's the thing that you use if you're going to do a really good dusting job, and there's a sense of nostalgia to it as well. But fundamentally, it's mundane and it's ignored. It doesn't have value. It's something we probably keep under the kitchen sink. If we lose it, we don't worry. We get another one. It's invisible. It's ignored. And in that sense, it shares that legacy of those invisible domestic tasks that happen day after day. And so that's where the connection with this cloth happens, that invisibility. is also portable and easy to stitch, and I've always got one in my bag that I'm stitching, and it's very easy to pass on to other people to get involved in the project too. So for just a minute, the duster that you're holding now, I would like you to invite you to really kind of to engage with it for a minute. So if you're comfortable, close your eyes. If not, maybe just kind of, relax your gaze, and hold your duster and take a moment just to touch it, to think about how soft it is. There's something that's so great about the duster as well, not just the invisibility, but the way it kind of, in terms of its tactility, references the comfort of domesticity. Domesticity is a good thing. It keeps us safe. It keeps us healthy. If we are ever without it, that's something that's a huge struggle. So there's something about that comfort that you can remember in the touch of the duster that's really soft. You can also thinking about smelling it. Now, my duster I've got here is straight out of the packet. So it sort of doesn't smell like my home or cleaning to me. It has been suggested that I should maybe share polish sometimes, or other cleaning liquid smells when I run a workshop. But maybe there's a smell that is there or isn't there. But is there a smell that you might associate with domesticity? And it might not be to be with cleaning. It might be to do with baking. It might be to do with just that kind of smell that your own home has, or a memory. And take a moment just to think about what they are and to remember as we move on. Just keep that in your back of your mind as we move on to the next slides. So, as I've mentioned, I make a link between the invisibility of the duster and the invisibility of many of the roles that fall to women. You can see on the right hand side there's pictures of me and my youngest daughter a few years ago. She's a bit older now, taking part in a photo shoot that I did with an organisation called Mothers Who Make, and they took some photographs and of us playing around with the duster. And I think it's really interesting to think about that relationship in a gendered way. And there's a quote that I come back to quite a lot by somebody called Pat Kirkham, who wrote a book called The Gendered Object. And she says relationships between objects and gender are formed and take place in ways that are so accepted as to become as normal as to become invisible. And so there is a way that we can associate that femininity and that legacy and that invisibility with this duster. So in crafting it, there's also a way of connecting with that legacy of stitch and women's work. As I can see, somebody's just commented, yeah, absolutely. Men do so too, and men have sewn for hundreds of years as well, and men do domestic tasks too, but the focus of this is women's experience, and so that connection to that legacy of stitch and women's work is really important, and there's lots of publications that sort of support the idea that women ended up working with cloth partly just because it made sense, it was practical. In other ways, we did it as a way of earning money before we were able to work independently as we are now. And it was something that you can get done around the house. When you're raising kids, it's hard to focus on something entirely. And so back in the days where there was no contraception, and particularly before the Industrial Revolution, when work often happened at home, working with cloth made a lot of sense, just practically speaking. And so that's kind of where that legacy began. But nonetheless, it's persisted in ways that are both positive and negative. There are also feminine links to red thread. It could be used to represent our sexuality, represent our strength, and obviously there are relationships to physicality there as well. Making together and telling stories is also something that has bound women together for centuries, and that's one of the reasons why I think that when you come together as women, I often feel like I've sort of got my foremothers just over my shoulder when I'm stitching, or when I'm stitching alongside other women. It's one of the ways that we make sense of the world around us. And the introduction of craftivism, which was kind of just emerging when I first began the project back in 2014, allows that quiet activism, the way to take part in something in a way that doesn't demand shouting and screaming, but is something that you can nonetheless collaborate in, be part of a community, and all of that builds empathy, and it also builds that sharing of skills. You know, there's so much online now about how to stitch, how to do all sorts of different things, and again, that I suppose comes back partly to that accessibility, but also that sense of building a community as we work together, whether or not we're working together in the same physical space, or we're working together in the same digital space, as we're sharing a digital space now, or perhaps you're just working knowing that, you know, someone else somewhere is doing the same thing, and there can be solidarity and community in that as well, which comes together through craft. So I'm going to invite you now to post a word into the chat that sums up domesticity for you. So there are no rules about this word. You can use any word you like. So it might be about celebration. It might be rage. It might be funny. It might be something to do with a memory. If you need 2 or 3 words to sum it up, of course, that's absolutely fine. But if you, as I begin to tell you some more about the project, take this opportunity to put some words into the chat, and we'll come back to them as we go on. Okay, so whilst you're thinking about some words, I thought I'd take the opportunity to tell you about where the project grew from, so what the inspiration for it was. So it actually began with fairy tales. So I mentioned just now about stories even. So fairy tales were one of the ways that women told each other stories. It's one of the things that they did while they worked. And it's kind of where that origin of the old wives' tale comes from. And there's lots of theory that as an academic I refer to and explore to underpin that. But fundamentally, it's about that shared experience. It's about saying, this happened to me. This is what might happen to you. This is how I dealt with it. This is how you might deal with it. This is a story of something that happened to me once upon a time. You can see in the picture here, this was, I've moved away from dusters for a moment and embroidered a rubber glove. And this says, you shall go to the ball. And I was thinking about Cinderella and gloves, and, you know, those beautiful velvet gloves you might put on to go to a ball, but also the gloves that you would put on to do the washing up, and those kind of associations. And so fairy tales was where I started. And that's why I then chose the duster, because I was looking for a domestic object, an object that immediately spoke domesticity in some way, something that would be easy to embroider, something that was commonplace in our homes, and something that perhaps might sit around the space when we were sharing and telling stories to each other. And it was at this point that I contextualized fairy tales within women's work as well. And as I mentioned, there's a book called The First 20,000 Years of Women's Work, which it sounds exhausting just in the title. But she says the compatibility of this pursuit with the demands of childcare was what led to that. And if you're interested, there's also another great book, a kind of seminal book really on the theme, called The Subversive Stitch by Rosita Parker. And she talks about stitching as a source of pleasure, as a source of power, but also powerlessness for women. And so I think there's something when we choose to stitch as women where we can reference that legacy, but we can also kind of reclaim it and say, actually, I'm going to use it for me now. I'm going to use it for my voice. And what better day to do that than on International Women's Day? These are the first dusters that I stitched. They're called Promises and Expectations. I made these back in 2014, started in 2012. And they include fairy tale phrases, which are kind of subverted a bit. So they say, once upon a time, her possibilities were endless, which discusses this idea of kind of, you know, that kind of young girl, young person with everything ahead of them, and then often ending up historically in that position where it kind of stopped and the only options available for her from that point onwards were domesticity. Happily ever after, this is not the end, is another phrase that I use here, again referring to that kind of thing, particularly in the Cinderella story, which reflects so many of the things that we are persuaded to aspire to even now. This idea of, you know, you'll get together with somebody and then it will be happily ever after. And of course, that's where it actually begins. And then the final one says, in a land far away, our dreams come true, which kind of just refers to that kind of aspirational side of it. And then I also chose objects that had a relationship to stitching and a relationship to domesticity and a relationship to kind of things that might frame things within the context of that domestic experience. So I have a thimble, I have an iron, I have some scissors, and I have an apron. The thimble says protective, obviously pretty obvious there, you protect your finger when you're stitching. Iron, because I discovered to my horror that it's one of the most commonly used weapons in domestic violence, so kind of acknowledging that happens. Sadly, that is some people's domestic lived experience. Brutal on the scissors, and then feminine on the apron, which was quite interesting to stitch because they were all very soft, gentle words. And at some point I will stitch one that actually talks about how powerful and amazing women are, not just the gentle side of things. And this work sits within the context of many other artists as well. Louise Bourgeois is my favourite artist of all time, particularly her cloth works. And I love the way that she chooses particular objects and puts statements on them, as you can see here in the example with the apron, where she's had to make myself forgiven for being a girl. I also love Tracy Emin's work, the way that she uses quilts in particular. And the way she kind of uses the types of shocking words you wouldn't expect on a safe kind of tweed quilt. And that's really powerful. Annette Messenger, a lesser known artist, embroidered French artist, embroidered sexist statements onto handkerchief, which she then hung and displayed, which inspired the way that I display the dusters. And of course, Judy Chicago and her famous dinner party, who used textiles, among other things, to reference the context of women. And craftivism, which I've mentioned already. This book was written in 2014, just as my project with the dusters was emerging, and it's now just absolutely exploded. And it ranges from you can take part in different ways. You know, there are all sorts of different things that you can do. And on the one hand, it can be almost kind of depersonalized and very activist in terms of perhaps leaving statements that deal maybe with the environment or other situations where people come across things that have been stitched, or people are sent things that have been stitched as a plea for things to change. Sarah Corbett works with it a lot in that context. Or the other context, which is more the way Betsy Greer writes about it, which is in terms of starting conversations. And I suppose Betsy Greer's approach really appeals in terms of starting conversations around the dusters. And what I bring to it is that additional element of the personal story, so that it is through telling personal stories that actually we can start those conversations and have change. And the project is shared in many different ways: community pop-ups, exhibitions and workshops. It's been in art museums and galleries, in symposiums. I've had it strung across academic halls, publications, social media, and very big on Instagram and word of mouth, always kind of sharing it. I'm just going to come back to the words because I can see that some people have posted there. Thank you. So we have pressure, failure, my own, and rage, unfair. I have dusters with various sports car motifs or models on them. Domesticity is in control. I'm sorry, losing my words there. Unequal and overwhelming. Thank you. Yeah. The idea of failure is so hard. That pressure, isn't there, that everything should be a certain way, along with everything else that we have to live with women. Not only are we supposed to be size 10, but our houses are supposed to be immaculate. And somehow, even though we are where we are in 2024, that's still there. And even that kind of choice to resist it is a choice, isn't it, sometimes? Thank you for sharing those. I'll continue to, anyone who joins, please feel free to kind of join that chat. The other thing that happened with the project, which was unexpected, was the impact that it had on project participants and myself. And that's one of the reasons why I've asked you to hold your duster in your hand through, if you have one, throughout this presentation. What I discovered is that stitching takes time. I knew that already. But what I didn't really know right at the beginning of the project was about that kind of unconscious and conscious exploration of this object. You're holding this object. It's a domestic cloth. It's unusual to embroider a domestic cloth, but there is this kind of cultural understanding, this understanding that sits within us that we may not necessarily even acknowledge, of what this cloth stands for. And when people spend time stitching it, particularly women, when women stitch into it, there is a connection that's made. There is actually a relationship that is built with that cloth. People say, my duster. I'm doing some research at the moment, asking people about their experiences of stitching the duster, and have been really moved by the impact that it's had on them. One lady told me, my duster counselled me. There's something about time spent with a cloth. And when I bring it into my academic context, it's interesting because I've realized the duster almost interviews people, but in a way that's really unobtrusive. That doesn't mean I go into their lives or their homes and ask them questions. The duster does that. And it will hold what you want it to hold, and it will hold your secrets. And so there's something about the discoveries that are made within it that really help build these communities. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, in response to the word that you've posted into the chat, is to think about an emotional response to your word. So you can post that into the chat as well if you would like. If not, please feel free to keep it private and personal. There's probably already a great deal of emotion attached to the word that you have chosen to write in there, and I can see that already. Might there be more words that might reflect that? And if you have a duster that you're beginning to stitch, perhaps begin to stitch that word into your duster. Or maybe it's a word that expands upon that. Maybe it's an image. It could be one of the things I sometimes suggest is that people draw something and put something within it. So have a think about that as I continue to share the project. Think about other words that might connect to your original word, or images that might do so as well. So, as I've said, as people are working with the dusters, what happens is that dialogues begin to emerge. So you can see a picture here from where the dusters were exhibited at the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill in East Sussex. And there are conversations, there are dialogues that kind of happen silently between the dusters themselves as well. The ever funny, ever popular ironing as pants is really humorous, which sits alongside the duster here, which says clean up or clear out. But you've also got people suggesting things that happen perhaps within ideas around social class. Somebody stitched one about the Queen, and this suggestion that she might have many houses to clean, which of course we know she doesn't. There's a comment here about artists recording their own domesticity. And then another one which features a fist saying knuckle duster. And so there are dialogues that happen between the dusters when they're on display that can be really powerful as well. And then when they are, sorry, I'm just flicked through too quickly there. And then when they're exhibited, those dialogues are things that begin to happen in person between people who will come with friends, come alone to see the dusters when they're exhibited. And often they'll find a duster and they'll say, oh my gosh, that talks to me. That's me. I relate to that. Coming back to that theme of stories. And those stories are shared, and that sense of solidarity and belonging really kind of emerges from that. And as I mentioned, very, very active on social media. This was a duster that my husband said this looks like a pair of pants, and now I can't not see it as a pair of pants. But what I was actually thinking about were those pennant banners like the suffragettes sewed, hung on a wooden jam spoon. But I made this in response to an advert that came out during lockdown by the government that said stay at home, and it featured 4 images, one of which was a woman ironing, one of which was a woman doing the cooking, another one of which was a woman washing the floor whilst holding a baby, and then the other one was a man lying on the sofa. It did get withdrawn the day it came out. I don't know what they were thinking, but I was obviously quite furious about this. And so this was the duster that I stitched in response. And this actually has become a bit of a catchphrase for the project as well. Domestic is not a female word. And taking the project onto Instagram has been amazing and has opened up all sorts of possibilities, including this. So it's great to be able to take this into the virtual world as well. One of the things that's come from that is a collaboration that I have currently ongoing with the wonderful grassroots charity We Care. So We Care is run by a lovely lady called Katie, and she campaigns for the rights of unpaid carers. So those are people who aren't employed as carers, but undertake caring roles for people in their lives, often because they are disabled, they're ill, perhaps they're suffering from dementia, all sorts of different reasons. And often they become very, very isolated. And often that caring is undertaken at their own cost. And so we worked with Oxfam and we invited unpaid carers to embroider their experiences of unpaid care onto a yellow duster, again, really kind of connecting through that invisibility. And they were hung at Welsh Parliament. So this is the inside of the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd building in Cardiff. And Katie and I went along and presented them alongside Oxfam and called for MPs who attended our kind of display and talks to recognise the rights of unpaid carers, which was an amazing experience, really, really powerful one to get involved in. And there's a few more close-ups here, so you can say one of the things that really came up was value, and someone stitched here, we are being swept under the carpet. So connotations as well. There's another one here called care, clean and create. And really just talking about value and calling for that invisibility that that's shared with the duster that unpaid carers experience, to be recognised and to be better, for them to be better supported. I also run academic workshops. Often I bring that into the context of drawing. So you can see here workshops that I do in that context, where the marks here kind of almost represent wiping and cleaning. And often the dusters don't end up flat with words on in these contexts. They often end up scrunched and manipulated as a way of really feeling and embodying that experience of domesticity. Other things that I've done with the project is to collaborate. So a different type of collaboration to the one with We Care, a rather cheeky one, with PEG, who are the Profanity Embroidery Group. And we collaborated last year to invite women to swear upon a duster and to vent their frustration. I have to say I had the shortest amount and the most amount of dusters submitted for that particular collaboration. We had 150 within the space of about 6 weeks. They were hilariously rude and also so sad and so brilliant, so much imagination behind them. So it was a huge pleasure to collaborate with them. And also was excited to have a self-portrait of myself that I did on a duster featured in the Grace and Perry Lockdown Channel 4 series, which was fabulous. As you can see, the dusters really do go everywhere and invade every bit of my life. So I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you some of the stories that sit behind the dusters that have been contributed. So there are some particular themes that I thought I would pick out. So you can see on these two links to the home. Home is where the heart is, and anchoring. And of course, many people talk about home. Home is that place of comfort, ideally. Home is not always a place of comfort. Sometimes it can be a dangerous space as well. And so the dusters kind of acknowledge that, and I take it into both of those contexts. But fundamentally, home is something that's associated with the domestic. So building on that, I would also like you to invite you to respond to that theme. So again, you might want to pop a word in the chat. You're very welcome to, as a descriptive way of how you might respond to this. I don't know if it's possible to post pictures, but if you're able to, that could be something that you could do. But I'd like you to invite you to draw a simple house shape. So it can literally be a square with a triangle on top. And to then draw, or to stitch, if you're working in stitch at the moment, an image of yourself inside that house. Think about how you will represent yourself. You know, you can be a stick figure. You could be another metaphor. That's up to you. You can also think about where you are in the house and how much space you take up. Do you fill it? Are you in a small space? Think about your relationship between your domestic experience and that home space, and think about what that might look like. And that might realize itself as a duster with a house on it and yourself in it. It might be inspiration for a different direction. So some more examples to show you. This again is always a popular one, stitched by fabulous illustrator friend of mine, Jackie, playing with that kind of Call of Duty idea, but she's changed what happens here on the controllers, and suggests this kind of playfulness between what she calls tea and buffet parties and domestic help. I love the idea that you could press the buttons and the ironing, darning, scrubbing or mopping might get done, or the vacuuming or the laundry, the dusting and the sweeping. And so this is a lovely example of some of the really playful approaches that nonetheless have messages behind them. Rebellious nonchalance is what I call this theme. There are many that sit in this theme. Ironing his pants is always a popular one, a really kind of fun response to it. Or the other one asks, dusting, what's that? And there can be this kind of playful sense of, well, I don't do domesticity, I don't dust, I don't care about it, which is kind of a humorous way of sort of venting those frustrations we might feel about it. This is another one, housework, what's the point? It just gets dusty again. Stop cleaning and make stuff. Couldn't agree with that more. On a duster, why not? Why not stop using it for dusting and use it to make stuff instead? Celebrating the mundane. That mundanity can be comforting as well, can't it? I love this one. When I'm feeling domestic, I put my pinny on. And then someone here has stitched their shopping list, which I am full of admiration for, because I know that stitching words can take a really long time. And it's just really celebrating that everyday mundaneness. Anger and frustration, of course, nonchalance, industry and rage. This lady told me the story of how she would pretend she didn't care, then get really hacked off, and then clean in a mad fog of rage that she was the one that was doing it. And the other one also reflects that. It says, tiny spores emit from my hoover whenever I clean, and that kind of rage hoovering, which I am definitely guilty of sometimes. Duty and expectation. One of these refers to that idea of a woman's place being in the home, and this idea of being judged, which I think was mentioned in one of the comments, this kind of pressure, failure, this idea of being judged on how clean your house may or may not be. And, you know, why does it come down to us that that's the case? And so kind of building on that, I'd like to invite you to relate what you've just drawn with your house to the duster and to that experience, and to imagine the duster is inside that house shape with you. So how might you represent that duster, and does it even belong there with you? How do you feel about it being there? How do you feel about your duster? And again, you might represent that literally. You might represent it with a scribble. You might represent it with a word. It could be literally drawing a picture of your duster. It could be whatever you feel. But think about that relationship between your home space, between you and between this duster that shares that invisible experience. Value. It would be an interesting thing to think about in that context. These two dusters, one of these was stitched by a student of mine, and she wrote "not skilled," and this is a tribute to her mother, which is a lovely thing to think about on International Women's Day, especially with Mother's Day coming up here in the UK this Sunday as well. Her mum was a cleaner, and she was frustrated that was considered not to be skilled work, whereas of course giving a decent clean is absolutely skilled work. And when her mum finally finished her job, it took 2 people to replace her, because she was so skilled at that particular job, so industrious. And so that's a wonderful tribute to it. And then on the other hand, we have someone who made a rosette out of their duster, And she says, I loathe housework and I am not going to do it. And actually, she was attributing value to that rebellion. I'm going to even give myself a rosette to protest against that, and to give value to the fact that I choose not to do that, which is equally interesting and relevant, of course. Invisibility, I've mentioned that word a lot. I love this one, the work I do and the work you see. I think it just sums it up so well, all of those invisible tasks and the mental load, of course, that sits within the context of that. And then the other duster here was sent to me, pictured on the ladies' ironing board, which I think is really important too, that kind of neglected and overlooked side of things. Yet more on invisibility, somebody linking that to the home, as you might be yourself in response to the prompt, with those roots. I think there's something that's so fundamental about these roots of domesticity that kind of pull us together, don't they? You know, when that's positive, that gives us roots from which to grow from. And she's stitched work in yellow so that we can barely see it. And then on the other side, somebody has stitched what is actually like a word search with lots and lots of words stitched in yellow so you can't see them. Then women's work is never done in red so that you can see it. And I've photographed it so that you can see the kind of almost sort of crinkled effect that this duster has, which again kind of adds to the tactility of this invisibility. Something else that comes up is memories, of course. And when men get involved in the project, as sometimes they do, often actually that's to do with memories. Often they will tell me about their mothers, and they will think about memories around domesticity. When younger people get involved in the project, often memory comes into it, and with all generations, all ages. And as I've said before, dusters are a way of expressing that experience, and really of making meaning from memory. And so this one, I'll give you a couple of examples here. This was stitched by a dear late friend of mine, Christine. And she stitched this in memory of the care that her mum gave her dad, who had dementia. And her mum went from somebody who actually quite enjoyed domesticity alongside her full-time job as a teacher. She loved making jam. She loved caring for her family. She loved making things. And then when her husband had dementia, suddenly she had that experience that I've referred to with the campaign I've been involved in with We Care, of suddenly being isolated, of suddenly it becoming something that almost chained her to her home. And so she stitched thousands of tiny seed stitches, with memory as this thing that was fading for her dad, and the memory that she has of her mother's changed domestic experience in response to that change in their situation. And so I would like to invite you to recall a memory that relates to your own domestic experience. And once more, you're welcome to put that in the chat, in the comments. That would be brilliant if you're happy to share it. If not, you know, of course, please feel free to keep that private. But I'd like to invite you to choose a word or an image, whether you're writing or you're stitching or you're simply thinking, that relates to that particular memory. And as in the example I showed you where the duster is twisted in the academic drawing workshops, you might also think about this duster that you're holding in your hand. Might you twist it? Might you flatten it? Might you fold it as a way of representing that particular memory? So I please, you know, do invite you to put your memories down at that point. Just coming back to the chat now. Thank you for sharing these projects. My pleasure. Such a pleasure to be able to do this. And further words, we have restricting. And then we also have love. And I think those are two fantastic words, because it is that tug between the two, isn't it? It's that kind of absolutely restricting, confining, having to do this thing yet again. But also, you know, we love our homes, and we love the people that we share them with, hopefully. Someone's shared here, I was older than I care to admit before I realised how much my mum did at home, as well as working full time. Yeah, I think it all takes us time to really appreciate that, doesn't it? It really does. And then suddenly one day it hits you and you think, wow. Pressure to conform, the stereotype of a housewife. Yes, that legacy's still there. Why are we still fighting this? And trying to do everything else as well. just, you know, if a dusters could be anything, I would love it if they could be the thing where we say, this is me, this is what I'm going to do. Forget the legacy, forget what you expect from me. This is what it means to me, and I'm going to do that proudly. Thank you so much for sharing. So moving forward, mothers, as we just mentioned, thank you. Brilliant prompt there. You almost read my mind. Love this one. Life doesn't come with a manual. It comes with a mother. Absolutely. If you're lucky, it does. And if you're lucky, it's a mother that's there. And as the lady who's just posted previously was saying, it's really important, isn't it? We're so privileged if we have had or do have that in our lives. I love this one too. Whenever I fold, which comes from a poem, whenever I fold a fitted sheet, making the moves that are like closing doors, I feel my mother. The smell of clean laundry is hers. Gosh, I nearly welled up there. That mirroring, I think there's something really special in that, actually. You know, as you can tell, I'm pulling from one place to the other. That tug is there all of the time. You know, there's so much pleasure in caring for people, in nurturing, even if it is just washing their sheets. But again, there's that, oh, why is it me always? And just wanting to be seen, not to be invisible, I think is really important. And those contradictions I've talked about. So these two dusters were stitched by the same lady. She stitched the first one, it's invisible and undervalued, in a workshop, and then came back to me about 3 weeks later, and had stitched this one. It's invisible threads holding home and family together. And it really is that contradiction, isn't it? On the one hand, the frustration, the lack of value and the invisibility of it. And on the other hand, knowing the importance and strength of domesticity, and that constant kind of tug between the two. Poems are something that people often go to. I read you the poem, or the part of a poem, about folding the sheets. There's one here, we are but dust and shadows, and then in brackets it says, but shadows are a lot less work, stitched by a dear colleague of mine. Beautifully. She's a graphic designer, and that always comes across in the text that she chooses. Again, quite playful, but you know, showing the things that we don't see, and using the duster to kind of visualize that. And then the other one is that famous dust if you must poem, which really kind of reminds us about how we might choose to spend our time. Reflective storytelling. I've mentioned storytelling quite a lot. One of the first one, which says 1940 and 2015, was a lady reflecting on a very privileged upbringing where they had servants as a child, right the way through to, as an older lady, working as a carer. And the kind of reflecting on the different responsibilities and experiences there. And then an incredibly sad one, which features a family tree at the top. And the lady who sent this to me talked about healing the mother wound, and wrote a story here about her grandma Grace, who was, by the sounds of things, quite a challenging grandmother and mother, somebody who perhaps didn't quite know how to show her love for her family, but showed it through cleaning. And sadly, she died with a dustpan and brush beside her, which is heartbreaking. But that she should die with just that and on her own. But a really, really poignant memory, a really, really poignant reflection, that is a tribute, really, to her grandmother ultimately. Some people have, this particular lady, Tracy, got involved with the project as part of some study that she was doing, not with me, with a different university, and again was sort of exploring her grandmother. And she actually covered a chair in dusters. She made a fantastic sewing basket with dusters in it. The word here, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, is housemaid's knee in Latin, which that leaning down and scrubbing. And so she really kind of embraced the duster into many different contexts. This is a lovely one between mother and daughter, which again has got a funny story behind it. Linda worked full time, was fed up with always being the one doing the laundry. Her husband shouted upstairs, bellowed apparently, where are my underpants? And she kind of lost the plot, and she shouted back, I am not the keeper of your underpants. So the mother stitched one and the daughter stitched the other. And apparently it was one of those arguments that goes down in family law, but they've approached it so humorously and so openly here. And sometimes artistic responses. So this was, one of the few husband and wife responses. And in this relationship, the husband did the cleaning and the wife didn't. And he felt like she was always scurrying around behind him, undoing the work that he was doing. And so one of them stitched lots of tiny little stitches, and then the other one has stitched big holes. And I love this pair of dusters for everything that they signify. Other ones are this. So this is by another good friend of mine, Sarah. Basically, everyone who I'm friends with, I asked if they will stitch a duster. And really, that's kind of how it happened. There are now hundreds in the collection, which is amazing. But to begin with, it was very much asking everyone I knew, would you stitch a duster, please? And so this was by a friend who was exploring her drawing practice by making a little drawing machine where she put a pencil in a box and then let the pencil make marks as she moved. And so I said, oh, please, will you do this when you're cleaning? And so she's done it on the one hand with drawing over the traces. On the duster, you can see that's just got the circle on it. And then for the other one, she put pieces of duster at the bottom of this drawing box with a red pen and let them make the marks as well, and then quilted them together. So many layers here to explore in terms of mark making, in terms of turning the duster into another domestic object that we associate with comfort, the quilt, and that, again, sort of making visible those marks that happen when we're cleaning. Time, of course. One of these was stitched by a lady who was just saying she simply had no time. I sent her the pack. She looked at the embroidery thread, said, you have got to be joking. I haven't got time to do it like that, and stitched it in wool. She's embarrassed by this duster. I absolutely love it because it says everything it needs to say. It's embodied into it. The way that it's stitched, what she says, the way that she approached it, just absolutely sums it up for me. At the time, she still is a woman with two sons, and at the time she was working as a production manager, a very busy, demanding job, and it was something that fitted around everything else, but nonetheless it was something she had to fit around everything else. No one else was doing it. And sadly, of course, domestic violence is the experience for many women. And as someone who's experienced an abusive relationship, not violent, but psychologically abusive, this really speaks powerfully to me. And it's important to acknowledge that experience alongside everything else. So the duster stitched by a lady that said knuckle duster, marriage buster, didn't tell me the story, didn't need to tell me the story, just said look after it, it's important. And then the other one was stitched in a workshop where somebody cut their duster and then stitched it together. And I rarely share dusters like this because often they sit very much within a private context, necessarily so. But I think it's important to acknowledge that not everybody's domestic experience is everything that they would hope it to be. And that's one of the ways that we can empower each other as women. These dusters were sent to me by a much older lady, and she wrote me a beautiful letter and said that she'd heard about the project, and these dusters talk about how women can make a difference in the world. We know they do. We know we have silently and invisibly been empowering and making things happen in the world for millennia, and it's about time that was acknowledged. And a few here from lockdown. We're drawing towards the end of the talk now, but thought I'd like to show you some from lockdown. Lockdown was when I took the project onto Instagram, and obviously that was a time when for many domestic became their entire space, and for many women it was the point at which all of those kind of threads that we held from the puppets that made things happen suddenly got snapped. And things fell on our laps, and so many women, particularly mothers, found themselves homeschooling alongside working, alongside significantly increased domestic load. I've also worked with the Girl Guides. Again, that was amazing, working with much younger people who probably don't feel the legacy of domesticity so much, but what they really grasped was this idea that the duster can be a voice, this idea that the duster can be a craftivist act. The one stitched here, I Will Not Live in Fear, was stitched by a 14-year-old who could no longer walk home from school because a man was hanging around outside school. And making problems, and so she had to be picked up, and so she used the duster as a kind of declaration of her own independence. And another one stitched by a 10-year-old said, "Why can't Peach save Mario for a change in the games context?" Just so powerful, so much behind them. The Duster project also works internationally. As I mentioned, it's very much a ubiquitous UK-based item. The one at the top with the pet with the clothes on a washing line from Australia, and the also playful one. It's an upside-down world with a COVID virus there in the centre for the O. In Australia, they do have dusters, not so much in other places. The one that's in pink came from India. The one that's in orange came from Johannesburg, and that pictures a shero, and that is a comment on the number of women of colour who still undertake domestic roles, much more than white women. And another really playful one with ironing lady, what's called an ironing lady. This particular artist in COVID imagined an iron going round on tour and doing exciting things because she couldn't, and so she stitched that on the best case, the yellow domestic cloth that she could find, and cloths in other languages. There's currently a lady who's doing the project in Spanish at the moment, so there's a whole host of Spanish dusters currently being stitched, and more in New Zealand with a wonderful lady called Janet, who's, because she can't get hold of them, is making them. So many fantastic things happening internationally, and the dusters will be going to Austria for Creative Bodies, Creative Minds conference in Graz at the university there with me this March, and also to Florida to the Museum of Motherhood and their conference, Threads of Connection. So the dusters are on tour, which is very exciting, sometimes with me and sometimes doing it all by themselves. And that brings me to the conclusion of this talk. So thank you so much for joining me, for your time. I hope you've enjoyed working through some of those tasks and hearing about the project. If you would like to get in touch, then through the blog, which you can see here, and I believe it will be also shared in the comments by the lovely team that are supporting me here and on Instagram. And I would like to invite you all to stitch a duster if you would like to, and to use the duster to be your voice, and to campaign for the rights of women. We have International Women's Day here today because we still need to do that. We don't yet have equality, and that's ultimately what we need. It's not about putting men down, it's about lifting women up, so that we can all be equal, and celebrate the amazing things that women do. Thank you so much to those of you who've put comments in the chat. Really, really lovely to virtually meet you. And I hope to hear from you with the duster. And even if you don't want to stitch a duster, please do get in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me to the Royal Voluntary Service. And yeah, you can see in the chat now, they've just posted an @domestic dusters. So that's Instagram. And then hopefully they will also please post the link to the blog, and the blog's got to contact me, so you can get involved or get in touch with me through the blog as well if you're not on Instagram. And really just thank you, Helen. Really, really lovely to virtually meet you today. Does anybody I don't think there's any questions, so thank you so much. Blog's just come up on screen now. It's been really wonderful to spend this hour with you, and happy International Women's Day to you all. Goodbye.